Now, obviously, a lot of attention is being given to the developing situation up in Oregon over the persecution of the two of the men from the Hammond Ranch, and there's a bit of a standoff going on up there. Now, the Hammonds themselves have surrendered to law enforcement to begin their 5-year prison sentences. They don't want any violence, but there's another group that's up there. They have invaded and taken over an abandoned wildlife management station. You know, the federal government's acting like this is an attack on the White House. This was an abandoned facility that these guys have moved into. And certainly the corporate media is attempting to portray all these people as terrorists and thugs and white supremacists. And that's because they don't really want to look at the issues going on behind all of this, which is a continuation of this policy that we've seen over the last decade of the U.S. government through its Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, grabbing more and more privately owned land for its own possession, even though this is a violation of the Enclave Clause of the Constitution. So, what's really going on? What is this all about? Okay, well, as usual, it's about a land grab. Now, up there in Oregon, the Bureau of Land Management for years, for decades, has been trying to grab all the privately owned land in the area to add to the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. Now, remember, federal ownership of the public lands is prohibited by the Enclave Clause of the Constitution. What most people do not know is that all of these wilderness refuges, wilderness zones, wildlife refuges, wetlands, heritage rivers are available to be pledged as collateral for U.S. government borrowing. Because after Nixon ended gold convertibility, and it became generally known that the U.S. doesn't have enough physical gold to collateralize all of its borrowing, Richard Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency to basically start grabbing public lands, taking ownership of them in violation of the Enclave Clause, in order to use them as collateral for future government borrowing. And by the way, this is exactly the reason the Founding Fathers put the Enclave Clause in the Constitution, to prohibit the federal government from looting the public lands to get themselves out of self-created economic disasters. But as the government borrows more money, they have to grab more land to use as collateral. And that's why we're seeing an escalation. They're not backing off one tiny bit. Now, to get the ranchers in the area to sell to the Bureau of Land Management, there have been a variety of underhanded tactics used. Back in the 1970s, the Fish and Wildlife Service declared grazing detrimental to wildlife and started slashing grazing rights. This drove many of the ranchers into bankruptcy and forced them to sell their properties to the government for pennies on the dollar. In the 1980s, staff at the Wildlife Refuge deliberately changed the flow of water to overflow Malheur Lake, which drowned out the ranches on its shores, destroying the ranches and forcing the owners to sell their property to the Bureau of Land Management for pennies on the dollar. The Hammonds are the last holdout, and the government covets their property because along with being a large chunk of land to be added to the refuge, it also has natural gas and uranium deposits, which make it ideal for collateralization. So that's what's going on. Now, back in 2006, lightning started wildfires across the countryside. The Hammonds started a backfire, which is a well-known and prescribed technique to prevent a fire from spreading, and it worked, halting the fires that were started by the lightnings. Now, despite this, the Bureau of Land Management arrested the Hammonds because the backfire they started charred some of the federal land. Nobody's going to arrest Mother Nature for the much greater fire damage caused by the lightning, but they've got the Hammonds, and they charged them with deliberate arson, treating them as if they had deliberately intended to harm the federal-owned land inside the refuge. Then they added the terror charge, and nobody will explain how or why such a charge is justified. That's the one that carries the 5-year penalty. Now, this is clearly an accident. To charge them with deliberate arson, that was absurd. To charge them with terror is absolutely ridiculous. But by forcing these two men to serve a 5-year jail sentence, they won't be there to run their ranch. The ranch is going to go out of business, and there will be the Bureau of Land Management ready to buy up the ruins for pennies on the dollar. That's what's going on.